Demystifying React Server Components. I hope y'all are looking forward to learning more about what's new in React, what we're doing in the world. Out of curiosity, who here went to either of Corey's talks this week so far? Ooh, quite a few people. Who checked out Ben's talk yesterday on renderers? Got one over there. Ooh, two in the back. Love it. Who went to Sean's talk on Zod and TypeScript validations? Okay, got a lot of hands. Ooh, this is good. Who went to Roy's talk yesterday on GraphQL and React Server Components? Besides Roy. Fantastic. So, and last but not least, who went to Jonathan Creamer's talk yesterday on bundlers? Okay, I know that one was maybe a little out there. Great talk, y'all should check it out online if you didn't, because it's just a fabulous history. I asked because my talk is a little bit of a culmination of everything you learned in all of their talks, but we're gonna focus a little bit more on the server components and server actions APIs, kind of what they are realistically like, how we can maybe wrap our heads around them a bit more. And so I'm just kind of curious what y'all saw because it's gonna be very helpful for my talk. So this is kind of what we're gonna talk about, and I realize how small that is now. But ultimately, the main goal of today is I want you all feeling confident about your ability to use React Server Components in the future. And I might start calling them RSC all of a sudden, just know, same word, I'm just using the abbreviation. So I hope that's what you take away from this talk, if nothing else. But we're gonna talk kind of about current availability, what adoption's looking like at kind of a high level, some of the history of what has gotten us to the React Server Component mentality and what server components kind of are holistically and what they might look like in other frameworks in the future. We're going to talk about some of the problems they solve. And then once we have all this foundation and we're able to kind of understand how to use them, we'll talk about some of the best practices. I ask, like, if you have any questions as I'm going, you're like, hey, I didn't follow what you just said. Go ahead and just shout at me, raise your hand. I will look up a lot. If your question's something I know I'm going to answer down the line, I might say, hey, hold that one for a minute, and if you feel like I haven't answered it by the end, there's time at the end, we'll talk about those as well. So this is an interactive talk in the sense that if you have questions or comments, like, I want to hear them in real time. For those that don't know me, my name is Dustin Goodman. I'm an engineering lead, and I like to say I built some pretty amazing products. Currently, I'm over at ClickUp, where I am leading their chat team. Prior to that, though, I was with this.labs, where I got to build numerous awesome projects, did a lot of content. You may or may not have seen me on the internet through them. I know I talked to some of you online in the past because of them. But I do tell people this as a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm really a Rails guy, disguised as an Angular developer who just happens to be a Node and React guy these days. So that's my journey because that's where my career's taken me a little bit. But please don't let that fool you. I am a React guy. In fact, I am one of the developers that actually made React.dev. So if you've used that site, me and my team built all the components you interacted with. So I like to take credit for that. That being said, couldn't have done it without the amazing Dan Abramov and Rachel Lee Neighbors, as well as the guys over at Code Sandbox. They built some really incredible stuff to make the interactive kind of guides and tutorials. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about React Server Components. So let's start by talking about adoption. My first question for you all is, who's actually using it today? And rather than just doing hands up in the air, I actually put a little straw poll together. We're going to look at it in a minute. So I asked, pull out your phones real quick. I'm going to talk for another 10 seconds. But scan the code, do the poll. I got it in another. It's literally sitting right there in that tab. So we're just going to kick over that in a second. But I want to hear what y'all have been doing with them a little bit and learn a bit more about your experience as we go. But while you're talking about that, or filling that out, let's talk about who's actually supporting React Server Components today. So if you've been keeping up with the React docs, if you've been doing React for a long time, you know that Create React App is no longer officially recommended by the React team. And a lot of that is they're saying you should use a framework. And it's because of where React Server Components are going to take us. And right now, today, we only have 3 fully supporting frameworks, one of which is new as of last week. But Next.js, Waku, if you've ever used it, it's a smaller framework, but it's a lighter weight Next.js. And we've also got Expo as of last week. So if you're building React Native applications, you now have access to server components as of last week. So this is a huge innovation for all of us. Simultaneously, our good friends over at React Router 7, formerly known as Remix for those who don't know it by the new name yet, our friends over at Redwood and Tanner Lindsley, who you might be familiar with from TanStack Query and everything else he makes. It's all truly incredible. He's going to have support for that in his new TanStack start in the coming months. So this is something they're all going to have early next year. My personal preference would be to have done everything today and show y'all it in Redwood, because I actually like where their integration's heading. They've had a preview of what they're doing, and I think it's going to be truly incredible when it's ready. But it's not. So we're going to stick to Next.js today as most of our demo, because it is honestly the canonical implementation, and it's going to be the best way to show you all how to do things. So let's go real quick. Let me find my mouse. Where's my mouse? There it is. All right, let's blow this up a little bit. Let's try to blow this up a little bit. There we go. So for most of you, about half of you, you've only done the tutorial. And then a third of you got it in production. Congratulations to those that have it in production. That is a feat. I've done a few of them, and it's not trivial. I like the side project, and some people have done some migrations. For those that did the migrations, I'm curious, or the one person who did a migration, what did you migrate from? Okay, well, we'll find out later, I guess. Sorry to put you on the spot if you're a little shy. Okay, so let's talk about React Server Components, but really we need to understand where they're taking us. We need to understand a little bit about where did we come from first. And so when it first came on the scene, y'all might have seen tweets like this one, or responses to tweets. This is Ricky from the React team. And a lot of what the comments were kind of saying when React Server Components came out were, ooh, React is getting way too complicated, or why is React so hard, or I don't understand why it has to be this way. And I love Ricky's tweet here more than anything, post, whatever you want to call it, because it really kind of captures why people shouldn't think this is complicated. What was complicated is everything that came before, and this is why I asked if y'all went to Ben or Jonathan's talk, because they really got into the depths of this. So I'm going to still defer that to them. They had a great one. But let's talk about kind of where we started. So if y'all remember what we were doing in the 90s and the 2000s, everything was server rendering, or static rendering in some cases. But effectively what we were doing is we were generating content on the server and serving up those static files to the UI. We didn't have any JavaScript until about 2000, 2001. Didn't really become popular until about 06, though. And so we would make these static pages, and then we were like, oh, but like if I have to make hundreds of thousands of these things and they're just repetitive data, like I don't want to do that. And so we started using databases, and with those databases, we would create more files more dynamically. Again, on the server. Everything was on the server. Nothing was on our client machines. And one of the first frameworks to really be on the scene for this was PHP. And I think it's really important to note this because Facebook, Meta, is still one of the largest PHP code bases on the web today, but is also the team that created React. So a little bit to understand where we're heading, we have to understand like where was their team thinking? What was their team doing before then? So I got this little, I promise this is the only PHP today. I'm not a PHP, I was a PHP developer, that's a lie, but I don't want to show y'all PHP all day. But this is just a very simple PHP demo, and as you can see, I've just got some static data that I'm rendering on the server, and all I'm doing is I'm just making some very simple documents using for loops. This is what we would have done with our databases to some degree, but as you can see, the real thing I'm trying to point out is, if you check it out, we have this PHP block right here, and this is where we're setting up all our variables, all of our data fetching, if you will. That'll come into play a little later. And then over here, we're just doing our rendering step, like we would in kind of this might look like a React Server component if you've been playing with it, but you have a little bit of content at the beginning, and then you have your JSX at the bottom. Same concept. And I'll be honest, I've got another page on here, so I've built kind of a router into here as well. And what you can see is we've got a very simple page, and it on the server renders the new page. And you can see my URL is changing, and I'm having to do full back and forth with my server on each different request here. And if I turned off JavaScript, you would see this site works perfectly because everything's on the server. It's just the web doing the web, making requests back and forth, getting static content. So that's kind of where we were with server-side rendering, and this is what we were doing for many, many years. Rails does this, Python does this. The original versions of Node did this. After that kind of era of server-side rendering, like, man, we could do better. Like, people want interactivity, they want it now, they want things to be faster. And because of Ajax and what we learned with Ajax, we're like, what if we just like did everything in JavaScript? What happens, because I just mentioned, like, I had to do back and forth with the server, and like, it was a long time between those page reloads, right? Like, you could feel the time between page 1 and page 2. And so your site would feel slow, and it wasn't a great experience. And we were like, okay, can we make this faster? And somebody had the great idea of, well, what if we put everything on the client's machine? And we let the client control all of the rendering, all of the data fetching. We could then do like loading widgets and make things look a certain way. And we said, yeah, that's a great idea. We should do that. And now we have single page applications, which we also call spas. It is not a spa day. I'm sorry. I know we all want one, but that's not what it is. So this was pretty cool. And so now we're loading a lot of JavaScript to the client. And let's just kind of see what that demo looks like. I've got another little one of these right here. So this is a React app that doesn't use React Router. I'm kind of just doing everything by hand just to kind of show you all the difference between the PHP version and the React version, just so we have a little more consistency between demos here. I don't recommend building your apps like this. This is very 15 years ago at this point. But you know, you could do this if you wanted. And so you can see I've just got my little basic example app, and then I've got this little router from React DOM. This isn't the React router. And it just renders all my paths, and down here you can see I've got all of my links, and it'll render everything, and then all of the outlet components. And if I come over to the demo here, you can see this feels so fast, instantaneous. Like, I click and data's there, right? We're not waiting very long. If I turn my connection down to a 3G or I turned off the network, it would still work to some degree because I have no server code here. I could also disable JavaScript though, and my site would crash. And I'm actually going to demo that because I think that's fun for this particular demo. So if we disable JavaScript, so if I go try to get my little dashboard here, as you can see, it's just like, yeah, I can't do anything anymore. Like, your site's just absolutely borked. And it's because I'm 100% relying on JavaScript. Now, somebody in here might be like, but Dustin, people always have JavaScript enabled. Who's disabling JavaScript? The answer is very few people. This isn't a real problem unless you're working in a hospital system or some enterprise where they have just locked down JavaScript onto the computer because they're worried about security or any of that stuff. So just be aware, like, this is probably not something you really need to worry about, but it's an interesting problem you might run into. So, one of the powerful things about spas, though, and I'm going to say this now, this is from the Remix website. They haven't rebranded it to React Router, so I'm calling it the Remix website. Don't at me, Sean. But what's going on is this is kind of showing what the difference, what the problem with spas really kind of became. Is we went and we said, hey, we could be really fast and interactive, but also now all of a sudden we have all these different loading states. And so what they've kind of demonstrated here is, if you look on the right-hand side over here, this is what a Remix app looks like. They server render as much as possible, and then they make the site interactive after a certain point. And you can kind of, if you look down here, as soon as that went green right there, now the page is loaded. Everything after that was just JavaScript execution. On the left here, though, you see you have the initial render, which was super fast, but then every single element below that had to render, and it took time. It had to fetch data from the server before it could render it. And so you have this waterfalling effect. And This wasn't great. I'm also going to flag, this is a slightly contrived example because everybody would build this differently, and this is what the Remix team really wants you to understand is like a problem with waterfalls. Like, this isn't what all applications look like. This is just what a lot of applications look like because we build them this way. With waterfalls and loaders not being a super great pattern either, but we don't want to block on like all this heavy rendering. What's the alternative? What can we do instead? And I kind of just alluded to it with what Remix was doing. But we're kind of back to server-side rendering all of a sudden. And it's like, are we just reinventing the wheel of what we were doing in the early 2000s? And the answer is kind of. It's not really what's happening here. And this is where we're starting to get into this hybrid approach of we start loading most of our content up front using server-side rendering, and then we hydrate it later using JavaScript and Ajax. And this works pretty well. And again, I wouldn't be here if I didn't put another demo together. So this is a Next.js pages router example. So I want to kind of show what we were doing right before the app router and what's going on with server components. So go away, you. So this is effectively the same demo. The one thing I've done is I've added a little counter to the page just to kind of show what interactivity could look like. But what you can see here is I've got my page and it's just the rendering. And if you look down, I've got my get server-side props, if you remember that. And you can see I'm fetching and I'm doing all the same data that I was doing in all my other examples, right? And if you look here, it's all here. All the pieces are in a single file. They're a little junky the way they're done. People don't really love being like, oh, well, I have to think up here to do this. I have to go down here to do this. But at the end of the day, what you end up getting demo-wise is you've got, as you can see, it's got that server request. It's a little slower. It's not as fast as maybe our SPA approach was. But when we want to get into the interactive bits, like our counter here, well, that's instantaneous. And that's because it's all working. Now, if I disable JavaScript here, what's nice is the router would still work. And everything about the page would work except for this counter. That's the only thing that would not work after that. So where does that take us? Well, let's talk about how React Server Components is very different now. This is, it's kind of the same, but not. And so the biggest difference with legacy server-side rendering is now you don't have to do a single bulk fetch for your page. You can defer loading to all the components you want, and this is where I have a little anecdote in my notes, and I hope y'all went to Roy's talk, but this is a great time where you could maybe think about Relay's pattern or Apollo's pattern of like, hey, let me put fragments in all of my components. They could query out of the local cache, and then maybe you would do a big query at the front, and that would allow your pages to load a little better, a little faster. You wouldn't have as much of this loading state as that's happening, and you don't have to do as much prop drilling. But what React Server Components is really doing is it's giving us the ability to compose our DOM a bit better, compose how React is rendering each element. So you have widget 1, widget 2, widget 3. Each of them need their own data. And before we would have had to say parent of widget 1, 2, and 3, fetch all that data, and then feed it into those components. Well, now what we're saying is widget 1, 2, and 3, put it wherever you want. They know how to get their own data. You don't have to worry about that anymore. And it's evolving kind of what we're doing to be a little more dynamic, a little better in that way. And so I've got my bigger demo now. So let's look at, not that one, but this one. So here's our first server component that we're going to look at. Just for context, when you're in Next.js, everything is a server component by default, unless you explicitly flag it as a client component using a directive we'll talk about in a little bit, or it's a child of that scenario, which we'll also talk about in a minute. But as you can see, I've got my product page here. And if you remember kind of in our PHP example, like I would go and I would just get the stuff in that little PHP block, look at my data, and that's exactly what I have here. Also, can y'all read this in the back? Cool. And then once I have my data, I do my rendering. And I'm going to disable this line just for a second, just to show y'all kind of what ends up happening. So going to our actual demo here. So I'm going to just go load some random product page here. And you're going to see it's taking a really, really, really long time. Now, the reason it's taking a really, really long time is because these recommendations at the bottom, they're really slow to render. The query that's running them takes 4 seconds. Now, it doesn't actually take 4 seconds because all this is static data on my machine, but I put some artificial delays just to simulate what a recommendation engine would actually look like in the real world. And so this isn't a great experience. It's like, oh, well, what does React Server Components actually give us at this point? And what's kind of cool here is this little component that I got rid of, which is our suspense boundary. Now, what suspense is going to do for us is suspense is going to defer the execution of the page and stream in our recommendation products component after everything else on the page is rendered. And so what that's going to look like, and I've got this little fallback thing, so you'll see what it looks like in a second, but let me go just choose a different page so you believe that I didn't cache something behind the scenes. So you can see that was almost instantaneous, right? And I'm going to just refresh one more time, and you can kind of see these recommendations take forever to load, and then they load in eventually. There is JavaScript here, but very little JavaScript here. The top part and the bottom part are both rendering purely on the server, and then when the document is ready, it's streaming into the page. The streaming bit here, that's still a little bit of JavaScript today, but it's much better than what we were building before. And so now, my top section here and my bottom section here know about their own data, and they don't need to be controlled by their parent component in any way, shape, or form, which is really cool. And this is where the real power of React Server Components is going to be coming from. So let's come back to the slides. All right, so what's next? So this is a lovely diagram. Oh, yes, question.
Yeah, just real quick, is React itself still loading in that little bit of JavaScript, or is it not needing to load?
Great question. So the question was, mostly for the recording and I'm on the mic, is React still loading when that little bit of JavaScript is loading? And the answer is, it depends. So in the case of just server components, and you use no use client directives, no React features whatsoever, React won't load. It has no reason to load. The thing that's doing the streaming, that's actually Next.js code. So this is why the frameworks are being recommended. They know how to handle the streaming of your components, how to handle the suspense boundaries. If you were trying to roll your own solution using something like Vite, you could do this, but if you follow Tanner's feeds on any of the social media networks, you can see he's just been battling this for almost 8 months. And I'd say, I like to consider myself a very smart man, and I feel stupid compared to Tanner many times a day. It's not that he's that much more intelligent. He's just in this daily. This is what he does for a living. And if it's taken him 8 months to figure it out, like, I don't want to try to solve that problem myself. So that's my answer to your question. Hopefully that gets there. So this is a little graphic I put together to kind of show some differences between kind of our server-side rendering world, our single-page applications, and now our new RSC world. My friend said that I sent this to said, hey, this is kind of confusing, so let me walk y'all through this because I couldn't think of a better way to demonstrate this. So on the left here, we have server-side rendering. And the big thing to note is anything in green is intentionally a server. Anything in blue is intentionally a client, okay? So right here, we've got our green frame with green background. Like, this is an entire server frame. We have this one entry point to our server, and this is where our content's rendered. And then we have these little blue widgets here that load in. This is our JavaScript. This is where we could like enhance our page progressively. And as you can see, these blue widgets, if they want to fetch data from the server to render or have dynamic content, like they're going to have to go to an API and fetch data that way. Here in our spa, what we have is we have this kind of server rendered frame. Like, it's not really the whole page, but maybe we put a little bit of content into it statically. But then the rest of it is just everything else is a new JavaScript rendered element. And then we have additional components that are rendering additional data, little widgets. Think of dashboard. Like, you might render the header, the sidebar, the title of the page. That's going to be your initial kind of green section here. But then you might have like, hey, this is information about the company, and this is your dashboard section. That's going to be your blue. and then these little blue bits here are going to be like your little like graphs and charts and things like that. Now, in a React Server component world, and actually one more thing to note, notice how both of these only have one single entry for your page from the server, just one server entry point. This is the distinction for React Server components. Now, what you have is you have multiple entry points into your server. This little demo that I'm saying here has 5 different server entry points. So this is your page. This is a component on the page. That's a component. That's a component. That's a component. These little blue bits right here, those are just your dynamic JavaScript that interacts with that data. And what's cool in maybe this instance, let's say that blue thing's a form. All right, that form is only going to communicate with the server inside of the frame of that component. It doesn't need a new separate API to do all of its data interaction. And I've got a demo that I'll show you all exactly how that works. But in this new world of React Server components, we have multiple server entries, multiple ways to interact with the server. You don't need an API if you don't want it. I recommend you still have an API. We can get to that in the best practices. But ultimately, this is what your new kind of rendering layout will be. And just to make sure I haven't missed anything important, reading my notes. Nope, that was everything. So, we've been talking about a lot about the server. We haven't really talked about what our friend just asked us about with how do we get React into the page. This is a React framework after all, right? So let's look a little bit about how we get our dynamic JavaScript. So React Server components run 100% on the server. So we can't use React 100% the same way to build our components. And then the question is, well, how do we make our pages dynamic? Well, what's great about this is there's a new directive called useClient. And what useClient does, it denotes that this component that we're building is going to be something that uses React features. There's some gotchas, and we're going to look at some examples about this. But actually, let's just go ahead and look at the code. So I built, let's go to the demo first, and then we'll go to the code. So I built a little infinite scroller, right? Infinite scrolling, for those that aren't familiar, you have to detect when the user hits a certain point on the page using the intersection observer to then load the next piece of content on the page, right? So there has to be JavaScript for this page to work. And what's really cool is you'll see I'm just infinitely loading in. You can see that loading state at the bottom, and you see that I'm just filling in more and more things. There's a little jankiness here. I'm still debugging why there's some jankiness with the scroller. But if you look, and this is the one thing I actually want to pay note to in this demo, is watch the URL bar a little bit as I start scrolling. You're going to see that I'm actually changing pages every single time I hit a new breakpoint. And it's the way the transitions are happening that's really smoothly. So if we go look at the code for this, what I've got here is I've got my page, server component again. And what this page does is it looks at all of the different parameters from our query parameters. It combines them, and then it renders out what I'm calling a product page. These product pages, y'all don't want to see that. So these product pages are actually in a file inappropriately named infinite products because I forgot to rename it. But what this component is this is also a server component. And all this does is it fetches some products from my server. Again, this is a fake client-based server, but it's a server. And then it loads in that content, and then this load more thing is where all the real client magic happens. So if I open this up, you'll see that the first thing is that this is a client component. And what this does is it's using a bunch of things, but mostly it's creating an intersection observer. When the intersection happens, it says, okay, update the page to the next page. That goes back to the root level, does the routing event, loads in the next server component, and that's where all the streaming happens. Now, I'm leveraging a lot of what Next.js gives me in terms of powering that. If I had a proper API and I was using fetch, all of this data would be cached on an edge function, which is really powerful and lets us just kind of render in real time. We don't have to refetch everything, and our page just feels really snappy and quick. So that's kind of what's happening here. So I decided, hey, I just needed a little bit of JavaScript. So what I did is I said, hey, here's my JavaScript entry point, and everything now that is inherited by this component. And if you can see, there's not really a lot. It's just a div and a ref. So something very simple. The skeleton here is just, actually, I'll show you all the skeleton. Skeleton. You can see it's just some divs and some tailwind. Nothing special, no magic, nothing up my sleeves. And that's all that's rendering here. Now, the only other thing that's kind of here is this use intersection, because that's not standard React, as y'all might have picked up. And this is just my hook. You'll notice I didn't put a use client here. And the reason I didn't put a use client here is because most hooks are going to be used on the client side. And once you declare use client at the top of a file, anything that it uses becomes a client component by default, with an exception, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Any questions before I move on? Fantastic. So, component structuring. So this is where the gotchas of client components really come to play. So first things first is I've said, hey, we can go and have multiple server entry points, and there's all this incredibleness, right? Well, the truth is you can't just switch back and forth between server components and client components. There's no use. I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to contradict myself in about 5 minutes, but there is no use server directive to make a component a server component. It is either a server component by default, or you've made it a client component. There's no switching back, with one exception. We're going to talk about that right now. So I'm not even going to pretend like I didn't steal this. This is from Delva over at the Vercel team. She made this graphic, and honestly, it is a 10 out of 10. This explains really well kind of how you should think about your rendering tree. So at the top, you can see we have our server component. And if you go down this left tree here, you see we have a server component that renders a server component, that renders a server component, that renders a server component, and a client component. And I'd guess based off of everything I've shown you so far, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty easy. I get what's going on here, and that feels good, right? Great, we're good here. Then you have this other side of the tree, which says I have a server component that is a server component that renders a client component that renders another client component. Again, everything feels good, nothing feels wrong. Now, we'll talk a little bit about client, like the use client and how it does some bundling, and I'm sure Ben talked about this a little bit yesterday, but just in case he didn't, I'll review it for you. But the one that's going to get you is right here in the middle. So we have a server component that renders a server component that has a client component that renders yet another server component. Now, you'll recall I just said you can't explicitly say a server component is a server component. Like as soon as it's passed to a client, it's a client, right? One exception, if you use props rendering, which I'll show you an example of in just a second, you can go from server to client back to server, and that's okay. And then some of the rules I'm about to tell you about client bundling reset the second you do this pattern. So it's going to apply only from that client and its children that are clients, but not its grandchildren that are clients. This is where the gotchas start to come in. Again, just checking my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything important that you all want to hear. No, not yet. Okay, let's talk about actually, let me go to the demo, and then we'll do the bundling. So, what? Oh, I accidentally put a space on the page. Ain't that lovely? So, inside of my app here, I want to show you all what this server, client, server thing could look like here. So this is the layout for my entire site. So if you're like, wait, what is the layout in this instance? The layout is going to be, and I lost my mouse again, sorry y'all. So the layout here is going to be just this top bar here. You'll see every single page that I built has that top bar. So that's my layout. That's what we're looking at. Now, what my layout has is it has this cart provider. And for those that are familiar with React, you should know that this is a context. And context, like it uses the use context hook and all of those features, which I said, hey, you have to be in a client component to use that, correct? So what's cool is if I go to my little cart context, you'll see that I have a client component right here. This component is a client component. And it's got all of my cart state. I also want to just give a shout out to Cursor. If y'all haven't used this editor, it wrote all this code. I'm not taking credit on this one. I was very impressed with what it did, and it's just really helped me speed up creating stuff like this. But if we come back to our layout component here, what we see is we have this cart component, right? That's not helping anybody. Thank you. Trying to find a good place for my mouse. All right, so we've got our client component, but then underneath it, we have all of this just standard React commentary. We have this other cart summary right here, which is actually also a client component, and I'll show you all that demo a little later. But what we have here actually, the way the React rendering tree is going to handle it is we have server component, client component with children, that is a server component, with right here another client component. So you can, when you pass through children, or another way you could do this is I could have passed it as a prop called children, or if you know the slot prop pattern, which is, if you're familiar with Angular, that's how they do multi-content projection. If you're familiar with Vue, they actually call it the slot pattern. This is that, effectively. If you do any of that, you can have a server component inside of a client component. And so for me, one of the first things I was like, man, I'm going to use Redux. I'm going to use Apollo. I'm going to use all of these libraries. They're all client components, right? And I was like, well, am I just going to lose the power of server components the second I want to use any of those libraries? And the lesson is, no, you won't, as long as you do this. You wrap all of those providers inside of a client component, inject it back into your layout like this. Now you have all of your features that you were looking for, and you haven't lost any of the power of server components along the way. Really, this was the first thing that I had to get my head around. As soon as I got my head around this, I felt like I could use server components anywhere. So going back to kind of the next thing to kind of look at, again, I'm stealing from Delba because, again, she makes incredible content. But this time, what I want to show y'all is what does the use client actually do? And this is again, Ben's talk a little bit, but we got to talk about bundling for a minute. With server components, we're not shipping JavaScript to the client, right? I said that earlier. But when we use client, we have to ship JavaScript because everything is now, interactive, and there needs to be something that says, hey, this is how I'm doing it. So let's just watch this together. It's a little video. But what she's doing here is she's got 1JS and 2JS, and now she's added 3JS. All of them are server components. Now all of a sudden in 3JS, she adds use client, and all of a sudden that becomes a client boundary. So now this is getting bundled and shipped to the client. Now she added use client to this 4JS and then commented out. You'll see that this whole block right here is being bundled together no matter what. That is one client bundle regardless of what she does. Any direct descendants of a use client child get bundled in the same JavaScript package. So if you're not into bundler theory, don't worry. Again, this is where your frameworks are going to come in handy. They're going to take care of it. Now, the one thing this demo doesn't show is, well, what happens if 2JS gets a child? Well, we would have two client bundles in that case. One for, let's call it 6JS, that would sit right here. 6JS would be in client2.js, whereas 3, 4, and 5 would be in client1.js. So we're going to get a lot of kind of bundling in that way. So bundlers, cool. What this is doing for us, really cool. That went in the wrong direction. We've already looked at that. All right, so let's talk about a little bit of use client best practices for a second, because I just showed y'all some weirdness here. So like you saw, you don't have to put use client in every component. In fact, y'all shouldn't. Use client should only ever be at the top of files that explicitly have to be. So if you're using a React feature, put that use client. Next.js is smart enough to collapse those use clients for you. Read the documentation for whatever framework you decide to use in the future when you adopt these, because they might not do that same bundling, and you have to be kind of aware of like where those use client boundaries are. But as a general rule of thumb, you don't want to just put use client in every component. So let's say you just have a fancy button component that has no on-click event. It could render on the server, it could render on the client. You don't have an on-click, it's just a vanity display button. Don't recommend that. My accessibility friends in the room, please don't yell at me for saying to make a vanity button. They should be accessible, they should be clickable, like, do good, please. But as an example, you wouldn't want to put a use client at the top of that, because that component could be on the server, it could be on the client. You really don't care in this particular instance. So if a component could render in either context, don't use client. But if it explicitly wouldn't render at all, your compiler, your bundler's yelling at you, put it in there. It means you need it. And then also, if you have a bunch of layered use clients, just know that the top level use client controls everything beneath it. Does anybody here use Astro or Quick out of curiosity? Okay, got somebody in the front. Okay, this is similar to islands, is what I wanted to share. If you've heard of island architecture, haven't heard of island architecture, this is starting to turn into what that is. They've stolen that idea, just made it a little better. So we've talked about client components, and we talked about one way, which is how do I go from my server to my UI, and I've had this nice one-directional thing. Now, we still have to go the other way. And how can I talk about my server? And I mentioned there is a use server directive earlier, but I also said it doesn't control your components. What it does do is it controls your actions. So, server actions. You can define them in two ways, but let's define what a server action is. I'm on the client, and let's say I have a form, and that form needs to submit somewhere. Well, I traditionally would have made an API call. I would have used Tanstack Query or GraphQL or something to send my payload to the server, right? Well, now I just write a server action. And this is code that looks like it's sitting on your client, but it is actually just running on your server. Your client has no visibility into it. It's completely secure. You don't have to worry about that. You can also write it to actually be kind of inline, like you just have a button, you're like add to cart, right? Think about that add to cart button, which y'all might have seen. I have a demo of that. That's exactly what's going on here. This is the same thing. So you can define a server component in one of two ways. So the first way is you put it in its own file. You put the use server directive at the top of that file, and everything in that file is now server bound and will not expose to the client. Super safe way to do things. And I definitely recommend writing server components this way because it makes it a lot easier to test them, and I like testing my server actions. Option two, though, is you can do it the dirty way, which is you put it in line. You just do an async function inside of your component. If you put it outside of your component, the whole thing's going to yell at you. You can't do that. You can only define a server action inside of a component. All right, so it's very explicit. I can't tell you the number of times I want to write this function up here somewhere, and my app just crashes. Like, what are you trying to do? You can't do that. So your compiler is smart enough to tell you what's going on there. So let's look at this little add to cart example that I mentioned. So come back to our demo. We'll go click into a product here. So as you can see, I've got some buttons over here, and I'm just going to do some add to cart here, right? And you can see it's taking a second because I put a delay. It's waiting on the server to come back and tell me everything's ready. But this is doing a server action. And what this code is doing is you'll see that my add to cart here is actually a client component because the button itself has an interaction. So therefore, it has to be a client component. But then inside of this component, I call something called add item to cart. And if we look, add item to cart is coming actually directly from my database. I just made my entire database a server action because that was just easier for this demo. But you could have put this in its own file. I'll actually show you what that looks like, courtesy of Sean. He encouraged me to do that yesterday. But what you'll see here is I'm calling a server action from a client component. And that server component, or server action, I'm sorry, that server action was defined in another file. I'm in a client component calling a server action, and that's okay. This is appropriate behavior. This is allowed in React now. This is awesome. This is why server actions are awesome. Because now you don't have to like think about an API call, do all your handlers, all your transformations. No, this action is just going to do everything for you. Now, I didn't write a particularly fancy version of this. If you look, it's just kind of updating some state and then just returning that property at the end, and it's doing what we call read validate path. I'm just going to show what happens if I get rid of this real quick, because I think this is a cool little, this is now a Next.js feature. This is not a React feature. I do want to clarify that now. Revalidate path, that's Next.js, that's not React. So if I go hit my add to cart now, you'll see my state in that upper right-hand corner, it's not updating. And if it is, it is because I'm doing all of this on the client. So I've kind of separated two things. I have basically a Redux state. It's not Redux, but it's a reducer that's actually handling all this add to cart logic for me. And if I actually go look, y'all might have seen the error earlier when I was playing with it, but in my layout here, you'll see that this cart summary is mad because this cart isn't actually defined on it. And it's because what I've done here is I'm just using the values that I have on the front end to update state. What I should be doing though is because now I'm using server actions and everything, this should all be server driven. But what you're gonna see in just a second here is, I'm just making sure everything's updated correctly. And the answer is, now it is. That's how Cursor just wanted to like disable all that for me. That was cool. I love Cursor for that reason. So if I go back to our demo real quick and I do a quick refresh, this is now going to be 100% controlled by the server. And it's going to be much slower as kind of result. And that's where that revalidate was coming in. Without that revalidate, that component doesn't update in real time. And that's why I had it, is because Next.js is trying to be smart. It's like, hey, that component was rendered on the server. I have no idea it's getting updated in real time. So when that server action is triggering, it needs to tell the client somehow that data has changed for this component. And because I'm not using the fetch API and I don't have tagging invalidation, I'm just having to revalidate my entire layout. There's a lot of strategies here. That's a Next.js specific talk, and I don't want to get into the specifics. This is about React Server components, but I thought I'd show you all some little nuances along the way. So, coming back, so let's talk about the misconceptions here. Like I said earlier, this does not turn your component back into a server component. Don't do it. You will be very sad. You will accidentally expose PII or create some security incident for your team if you do this. So just be aware, this is not good. Please don't do it. What I do recommend though is React does ship something called server only. It's a package they have, it's great. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna flag your server components as server only features. And then if you try to import it incorrectly or whatever, the runtime will let you know that you try to import a server component out of context and it won't render correctly. So absolutely recommend that package. We've talked about everything else that's on this page though, so I'm gonna keep going. Let's talk about best practices. I love best practices. Now I am gonna start by saying this is not React community approved best practices. There are not React community approved best practices. We all can't agree on this. It's a constant debate and argument. You can go and ask 3 different people, you'll get 3 different opinions here. So like the dude, well, that's just like my opinion, man. All right. So let's talk about suspense first. I showed you all this earlier, but I love suspense. If you are writing a page that has a heavy query later down your page, you absolutely should consider suspense here. It will defer that component's rendering time and it will make the important stuff on your page render first. So think about a blog post. You might have your blog and then you have some recommended blog posts at the bottom. Those recommended blog posts are so far down that page, they don't need to render right away. They can render in the background before the user gets there. Stream those in, use suspense. Like the recommended products there. If you have a big heavy dashboard, maybe you need the first row of dashboard items to show up first, but then everything below the fold, defer those. Find ways to use suspense to make things better. You look at, if we go back to the infinite scrolling pattern that I showed y'all, that first page, that rendered without suspense, and then every single element after that was a suspense pattern. I will say this now, I'm a little sad about suspense though. It's not as powerful as I want it to be. If anybody here is familiar with Angular's new defer API, that's what I want suspense to look like in a couple months. If you're not familiar with what that does, they give you finite control over when a boundary actually will load. So if you want like on load, it'll do that. If you want it on render, you can do that. One click, it just creates different triggering points for when a component actually loads onto the page. The React Suspense API is very simple. It'll load, but it just isn't your priority. Whenever its data is ready, it'll render. Making sure I didn't miss anything. Nope, that's it. This is a me-specific naming convention. My team at this dot used this, and it saved us hours and hours of headache. If you have a client component, call it component.client.ts. You might have seen some examples as I was going through. I had some components that were .client.ts. I had some that were .server.ts. This is the recommendation here. If you're doing a .server.ts, use the server-only import. If you're using a client component, put the use client. If it is neither of those, don't use this at all. And most importantly, if your framework has a convention that it's following, that takes priority. So page layout in Next.js, like don't put a client or a server on that. You'll have a bad day and be like, why is my app broken? I don't understand. I speak from experience. Fetch everything with a cache. I love GraphQL. I will talk your ear off about it. Roy and I are both here. We will both talk your ear off about it. If you're familiar with GraphQL, they have this data loader pattern. I highly recommend it for anything server component related. So let's say you have like a page of products, and on the server, I would fetch all the data you could about those products, even if you're only using 3 fields, server side. Because later what's going to happen is you're going to do a fetch for that same product on like the product specific page. It's going to use the same data cache if you set up your cache correctly. Your page is going to feel instant. Everything's going to feel perfect. So fetch everything as early as possible. This is also going to help you avoid prop drilling and any like data sanitization that you're worried about. So huge recommendation. Colocation. This is something that I have a demo for, and I'll show you all in just a second. But whether you're doing GraphQL queries, loading spinners, skeletons, some other data loading pattern, you have things that are just specific to that page, like another component you need. Keep everything in the same directory as long as possible. I know as React developers, we like to take our reusable components and put them in our components directory and our source and make them available everywhere. That's not what you want to do here. You want to keep things bundled together because there's this one-to-one relationship. Don't use barrel files though, because you'll be wondering why your app's really slow once you hit your 100th file. And I'll tell you now, it's because you used a barrel file. And here, I'll show you all that quick little demo. This is 100% credit to Sean because he encouraged me to make this demo literally at the last minute yesterday. And I said, you know what, that's a great idea. I should absolutely show you all this. So what I made here, and I didn't route it in the app at all, but it is here, I promise, is I've got a little contact us page. And this is I'll make that a little bigger for y'all. This is a server component form with a server action. So if I go click, what you'll see is I get all this lovely validation. If you want to learn how to do validation, Sean's right there. Talk to him after. But what I've done here is I've created a little server component. And what I've got here is you'll see I actually have my contact form that accepts the server action. That is a submit contact. And the submit contact is my little inline server action. As I said, you can inline it. And you just say, hey, this is a server action by saying use server. And inside of here, I have also, good clarification that I should say, you can only define server actions in server files. You cannot do what I'm doing here in a client component. Don't try, that's what the other file's for. Another best practice. But what I'm doing here, I'm getting some data out of my form. I'm running it through Zod's validation. And then if it's not successful, I'm returning all that validation information. If it is successful, I'm not actually doing anything with it because I don't have a server reset. And what I can do here is I can actually just reset the entire form if I wanted to, or return all the data to the front end. Pretty handy. If I go into the contact form itself, you'll see I'm using my client notation like I recommended. And at the top, you can see it is use client because I am using the use action state. If you go to Next.js's documentation today, they will say to use something called use form state. That is incorrect. That is not the API. This is the API. I learned this yesterday, putting this demo together. I was like, oh, they haven't fixed it yet. Anyway, so this is use action state. And what you do is you take your server action, you pass it into action state. It does some wrapping around it to handle all the state. And now what I'm doing is I'm just rendering everything out of state onto my DOM exactly like I would do in my classic React example. So this is the React you know and love. It's very easy to get there in just 2 steps using server actions and server components. I'm trying to think if there's anything else super fun to share. If you were at Corey's talk yesterday, which most of you were, you'll know that you could do more with the server, the submit button if you use the form state, which is a different than the server, the use action state, different APIs, but recommend that to make fancier submit buttons. What am I missing? No, that's it. Except for, let's look at the directory structure of this real quick. So I have my contact us form, I've got my client component, I've got my page, I also got my types co-located. Kept it all as close as possible because all of this is going to live together. It doesn't make sense living separate from its pieces. Doing something similar with my products here. I did separate these because each of these pages was sharing my components, but let's say each of these had a unique product rendering. I would have left that as close to this as possible, including the skeletons, but they actually made more sense living inside of my source directory. So if you're coming in like, hey, Dustin, you said to do this, and then I looked at your demo and you didn't do that, well, I have my reasons for it, and there's always exceptions to best practices. All right. So we're kind of at the end of the talk. So let's do a quick recap. First off, server components are giving us multiple server entries into our app. It's really powerful, lets you do a lot more rendering. 2, we don't have a lot of frameworks that support this today, but more are coming, I promise. They've been promising it for a while. They're all trying to get it right because this is not the easiest pattern in the world, and to get it right is detrimental to any future for those frameworks. So they got to get it right the first time. There is no redoing it. You will thank them later for taking their time. I don't recommend adopting today, if I'm being honest. Next.js, I think, was ahead of the curve, but you were also living on the edge with React on canary builds. They could have broken in any time. So I actually don't recommend server components until React 9 is officially released, which is coming any day now. So just be patient, a couple more weeks, and I would say start adopting this. Those who are in production, you are frontiers, you are saints. Let me know how that's going, because I can tell you it was a little rough for me and my team when we did it. 3, use client. It's going to give you new bundles. Use server is for actions, not components, and this is going to give you a lot more control over what's happening. Find some best practices for your team to simplify the adoption. I gave you some of the ones that me and my team were using. They were great for us. They might not be great for you, and that's okay. Figure it out. It's going to be very much product to product specifics and project to project specific. So like some of the best practices I just showed you made sense for us and our team at that time. Didn't make sense for this little demo I put together. So there you go. And finally, just be mindful of your business and project's needs before you do any adoption, because this actually, like, this pattern's really powerful and great, and I think it's the future of what React's going to look like. But if it doesn't make sense for your project right now, don't do it. Like a spot might be perfectly acceptable for your app. You might have SEO concerns that we don't know all of the ramifications of what server components are doing to our SEO. So like maybe if that's important for you, stay with static rendering. There's caveats to everything, so this is a great pattern to adopt if you have time. But if you don't worry about it. It's not a stress case. So I want to thank you all for coming. I also want to answer your questions, so this is a great time to ask them. But in the meantime, while I'm waiting to see a hand, if you want to connect with me or you want the slides, the QR code is actually for the slides. The last slide has all of my information. I'm primarily on Blue Sky these days, so if you want to connect, that's the best way. If you do happen to find me on LinkedIn, I appreciate that. Come talk to me first, though. I'm a little picky about my LinkedIn. I like to know you. I like to know your name. I want to put a face to a name before I say, hey, yeah, let's connect. But I'd love to connect with you on all the socials. And thank you for coming. I hope you all feel better about React Server components, and I think I was seeing a hand coming. Let's hear it.
So when thinking about the design of my server actions, should that basically just feel like I'm creating an endpoint, like follow the same as I would normally?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question for everybody. The question is, when I'm designing my server actions, should they look like my old APIs? The answer is no. Server actions don't have the same mental model as your old APIs. They're more like RPCs than they are like, they're not RPCs, but they're more like RPCs than they are traditional APIs. So think about them more as functions and just use them as functions and then throw errors and catch errors as you need to. I wouldn't return errors as errors over, like I wouldn't throw an error in a server action and assume you're gonna be able to catch it from the front end. I would catch it, shape it, pass it, and then handle it on the front end. But that brings a great second question is, should you still have an API? Depends on what you're building, but I actually recommend not moving away from your APIs. Just use your server components instead of accessing your databases directly. Use your APIs, because the one thing that a lot of these frameworks don't support are things like queues and background workers. So if you need a lot of like inter-process communication across systems, server components are not going to be, or these frameworks are not going to be your best friends. So having an API that can still do all of that for you is probably going to be your best bet. You could have a separate database connection in a separate service that handles that, and then you have your app that's also handling that. Again, case by case, I can talk you through about 10 scenarios where I would do it 10 different ways. But I love that question. Any other questions? In the back.
I don't know when this would be useful, but can you totally make async functions server actions, or can you make regular functions server actions as well?
Okay, so the question is, can you ever make a server action non-async? Okay, answer is no. Because by practice, they are promises. Because you still, in practice, you are still going over the wire. Like, the action isn't running on the user's machine. It's running on the way Next.js does it, if you deploy 3for-cell, is they're actually setting up edge functions. And so those are going to be running on somebody else's machine, which still means there's a network request, and you're still having to wait for that network request to finish. So until all that's done back and forth, non-promise doesn't make sense, because you're still in promised land. Pun kind of intended. Great questions, by the way. I love those. Okay, I got time for 2 more.
This is sort of a commenty question, but do you get the feeling that this use client and having to make a decision about whether something is server or client couldn't one day be automated?
That has been a conversation. I think we all would like it to be automated. Because of the way bundlers and compilers work today, it's not possible. Dan Abramov has talked about a future where this may be possible, but it's not on anybody's roadmap or in the foresight for now. So I don't have a feeling this is going to be a thing that changes anytime soon. And repeating the question for the recording, is there a world in which we don't have to define use client? Great question. I think I saw one more in the back.
I was just curious about like the cacheability of the server components. Like, are they cacheable at a little chunk level, or is that still like a
Great question. Are server components cacheable at the component level, or is it still just the fetch level? The answer is both, but it's not free. You're going to have to do it yourself. Now, Next.js tries to do some of it for you under the hood, and it does a pretty good job of it. But the API, my best practice, and the point I was trying to make was about the API calls, because while I don't agree with their decision to overwrite how fetch works, it was a pretty good decision in terms of like high cacheability, high availability. But server components do cache. They cache really well. I didn't have time to get into it today, but if you look at a server request for a server component, it's just JSON, and it caches really neatly. So it's possible. 100%, like server component apps are 100% cacheable. I'm at time, but sure.
I think yesterday I saw those Corey's presentation. He showed throwing dependencies off the server side. Like I think he did Day.js with one of them. What are like the kind of best practices for that? If you're using stuff like Pause, would be really good to kind of cache SVGs. So
I love that question. The question is, what dependency, so yesterday Corey was showing that he threw all of Day.js on his server. His client components never needed it again. What dependencies can you defer to the server versus which ones need to come to the client? He specifically quoted Font Awesome here. It depends on what parts of Font Awesome you're using. You could 100% throw Font Awesome on the server though, because they're just icons, so they don't actually have to load onto your client at all. Because they're just SVGs at the end of the day. So you're just creating server components for that. But if you get into client rendering mode, that will load. I actually really liked Corey's example though, because in my head, my immediate response was, oh, I wouldn't do that in the first place. I'd just make a good GraphQL endpoint that you can actually give a directive to and get the data in the exact format you want. So your server's always the one holding the bundle. That's my solution. What are the best practices for that? There really aren't. It's just going to be dependent on like what is the package, what is it doing for you? Is it a client? Is it a server? The client components are a great example though, and Day.js was a great example for him. Great question. I've held y'all over 5 minutes. Thank you for staying. I'm honored. I hope you all enjoy the break, and thank you for coming to my talk.